Hi, everybody. Welcome to Rational Conversations. Once again, I'm Abhijit, as usual. And today we are going to be delving into this world of the LGBTQIA plus community and the science behind it, the social circumstances, and a lot more. And if you've got any questions regarding the LGBTQIA plus community, and or feel that it's somehow unnatural or weird or just strange, or you fear them for some reason, this is the show you need to be tuning into. And because I've got a very special guest on who I've been coordinating with for a while to get this show done, and we're right about to get going. Sayantan, welcome to Rational Conversations. I'm so glad we could make this happen. Sayantan is a faculty member at the Center for Writing and Pedagogy at the Kriya University and an independent science journalist, which, of course, immediately got my eyebrows and ears perked up. And I was like, I have to get in touch with this guy. Their work lies in the intersection of gender, sexuality, science, health, and caste. We can't get to all of these things, but we are definitely going to be delving into sexuality and science, every aspect of sexuality that is relevant in this area. So, Sayantan, welcome to Rational.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Abhijit. I must apologize for not making it to the last meeting.
Oh, no, that was me.
Glad. Yeah, but I'm really glad that I could come to this one.
Yeah, I'm glad. And I'm sorry for being so scattered, but that's just me. But I try to be rational in everything else. So first and foremost, your pronouns are they, them. Now, this is something that has been blowing up on social media, on news channels, on basically every platform of being able to understand pronouns, because people, I think, have a very deep misunderstanding of, or lack of understanding at all, about pronouns and why they're important. So why are you, first of all, they, them? And how has this whole pronoun thing actually gotten rolling? And why has it suddenly become so important to discuss?
So the idea of pronouns, if one were to look at language, is rather simple, right? So pronouns are basically words that act as placeholders for nouns. So if my name is Sayantan and if I go by they, them, then in a particular sentence, you should be able to refer to me not by using my name, but by using my pronouns. And that applies to the conventional traditional pronouns that we have, which are he, him, his, and she, her, hers, and what we call the neopronouns, which would be sie, them, theirs, she, him, hers, and there are several others. They, them, interestingly, is not a neopronoun in the sense that they and them has been existing in English vocabulary since we speak the kind of English that we do. And irrespective of whether we pay attention to it or not, oftentimes when we do refer to a group of people, we end up using they, them pronouns without really affecting our language and the ease with which we use language at all. So one of the things I think is this entire issue of finding it difficult to incorporate new pronouns or new uses of pronouns in language is probably driven by the kind of homophobia and transphobia that also drives queer and trans people outside of society. Coming to the question of why do I use they, them pronouns? So I identify as a non-binary person. By that, what I mean is that when one talks about my gender, oftentimes gender is imagined as a binary spectrum. What that basically means is that on one end of the spectrum, you have cis heterosexual male or cisgender men who's assigned sex at birth and the gender that they identify are completely congruent. And then on the other side of the spectrum, in this model, you would have cisgender women who's again assigned sex at birth and their gender identification is completely congruent. And then there are identities in the middle, in some sense, of these two cisgender identities, which are called transgender identities, where there is a certain degree of I don't want to say incongruence, but a certain degree of nonconformity between the gender, between the sex assigned at birth and the gender that they identify with.
Mhm.
The idea is that this is one model of gender that assumes that gender is organized as a spectrum, and you do have these two very sort of bimodal distributions of cisgender people on two sides, and then there's a minority of transgender people somewhere in the middle. And then there are different models of gender, which also tells us that gender might not be a binary at all. In fact, there are far more complex models of gender that tell us that gender is constructed on a day-to-day basis. Gender is constructed in the kind of situations that you participate in. Gender is constructed in the kind of social spaces that we occupy. And these models tell us that gender actually might not be articulated as a binary at all. And people who believe that their gender identity does not necessarily fall within these within these binary classifications of gender often go by the term non-binary and often prefer they, them as their pronouns. And I'm not essentializing any of this because it is not an essentialized thing. So I can't say that all non-binary people go by they, them pronouns, because they don't. And I can't say that anybody who doesn't believe in the binary model of gender identifies as non-binary. That's also not true. But yeah, those are, does that answer your question?
And you mentioned a couple of pronouns earlier on. Did you say je, jim?
Yeah, so there are XC/XIM, which is how Z's, this is she, shim. And then there is ZE, Z, and then there is ZIR, zir, which is also a set of pronouns that are used.
So what do those entail or mean?
Oh, it would entail the same thing, that replacing your name with the pronoun he. I'm assuming that you go by the pronoun he. So it would entail the same thing. It would serve the same purpose as replacing your name with he in a sentence would serve.
So it would have the same implications as a they, them, but closer towards, maybe not smack in the middle, but closer to one of the sides. Would that be fair to
So the idea is that, yeah, so the point is that this entire model of one of the sides, I think that there are two sides to gender at all. I think these are deeply problematic models of gender, in the sense that there's no reason for us to believe that there are these two sides and we can ascribe one pronoun to one side. Really, it's an idea of how do you identify, and what language do you find that you think can help you understand or articulate yourself better. So what I'm essentially trying to say is that you do not get born and you are told by somebody that your pronouns are easier because I think your gender lies somewhere here or somewhere there. You grow up, you have confrontations with the sex that you've been assigned at birth, the gender identity that you've had to sort of live with for the rest of your life. And you start looking for vocabulary, and then you encounter vocabulary. And once you encounter vocabulary, you have this feeling, this intuitive understanding that, well, this seems to be working out the best for me. And you go ahead with that one. So that's how people come to their pronouns. So what I'm saying is that it's slightly hard to pinpoint where in that line of gender does a particular pronoun fall. And for that matter, one deeply doubts whether gender can be neatly organized in that line at all. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to get into as much science as there is to get into, but a little bit later on. First, I want to understand, I want you to tell your story, as in how did your journey of understanding your gender and your identity happen? I don't know, start at the beginning.
Okay, well, I must say that there's nothing extremely fancy or dramatic about this. Anyway, I grew up living primarily as a man for the bulk of my life till I was about in my undergrad. And in my undergrad is the time when I realized that I'm probably queer. There was definitely no doubt about the fact that I am somebody who's been assigned male at birth, and I like people who've also been assigned male at birth. I think that
Mm,
was quite clear by the time I was in my undergrad. And then one lived with the label gay for some time.
mm,
And eventually, around my master's or so, maybe at the end of my undergrad, maybe the beginning of my master's, by that time I had already read up significantly on sexuality and gender, and I was also working a lot with transgender people in the country. So in Hyderabad, which is where I did my master's from, I
mm,
filed two public interest litigations around the rights of transgender people in the country. I was also writing for a magazine that was called Gay Laxi magazine. It's still in publication. It was one of the earliest journalistic platforms that I actually wrote for.
mm,
And eventually, one started questioning the gender that they've been assigned as well.
mm,
And it took some reading, it took some conversations, it took some shuttling around between different possible identities that one could occupy. And for the time being, I have settled on the label non-binary as of now. And like all labels, it is subject to change eventually.
mm.
So yeah, I wish it was more dramatic than that, but unfortunately it is not. Yeah.
No, no, I didn't mean it to be dramatic. It's
Oh no,
more that
absolutely. I understand.
people these days have a tendency of reacting on memes and sound bites without really understanding the story and the life that is behind it, or the
Right.
perspectives that are behind it. And I
Right.
find that very unfair to the people who are speaking, because a lot of the times the things that they're saying that
Right.
actually are just mischaracterized or misunderstood at the very
Right.
least. One thing I did want to do was
Right.
I would like to go through the prominent letters of that
Mm,
make up the name of the community, and kind
right.
of flesh out each one and how the distinct one is distinct from the other. So we have both, of course, we have things which are talking about sexual orientation on one side, and sexual and gender identity on the other side. So first, of course, I think the first couple people probably know, which is LG is lesbian and gay, which is homosexuality, first with females and then with males. So gay is with males. Now, transsexual is something that is deeply misunderstood at this point of time. So
Right.
could you take us through what exactly transgenderism is versus
Right.
transsexuality? And
Right.
let's start there, and we'll dig deeper afterwards.
So I'll start by saying that great move at identifying that there are distinct kinds of communities that we are talking about when we are talking about people who fall in the LGBTQIA plus bracket.
Yeah.
So like you identified, there are gender identities and there are sexual orientations, both, which effectively tells us that this is not a homogeneous community. So
Yeah.
one of the things that we've been trying to do is
It's a
say,
community of communities,
yeah, so we're
basically.
trying to say that it's LGBTQIA plus people or LGBTQIA plus communities rather than
Mhm.
use the singular. That's one of
Yeah.
the things that your listeners and my listeners might also might want to take note of.
Mhm.
So one is that. The second is the question of vocabulary in terms of whether you call people transsexual or whether you call people transgender. And the idea is that till 1990s, it was more or less okay for people to use the term transsexual. But since then, given that the theory of gender has evolved significantly, and we do have a very clear understanding of what is sex and what is gender, we do, for most people, again, I don't want to essentialize it, but for most people, I think the term that they prefer is transgender. The and I'll come to explaining what this is in a bit. The other point that I wanted to talk about is that we often talk about these as if they are conditions, right? So we say transsexualism, transgenderism, homosexuality, and homosexuality is probably okay. But the idea of ISM, the suffix ISM, has often been used to signify medical conditions, which
Mhm.
these identities are not. So we
Mhm.
specifically try to then not use those ISM terms. So we don't say transgenderism, but we say
Mhm.
transgender people.
Yeah.
So again, this is something for the listeners to.
It's something I need to ingrain in my mind too, because I think isms are also used in a lot of in describing ideological systems or belief systems.
Absolutely.
So atheism, for example.
Yeah.
So that's why we have to, I mean, we have to be aware that this is not an ideology, this is not a belief system. It's
Yeah.
far, far deeper than that.
Yeah, I think we're basically talking about identities when we are trying to talk about labels.
Yeah.
And so the individual is very important to the idea of an identity, right? I mean, there's an I in identity, which is really the crux of what constitutes identity.
Yeah.
And the reason why I pointed that out is because this is that space where one can talk about language, both in terms of how it should be used and in terms of what it means.
Exactly.
So now coming to the question of how does one talk about transgender people? So the idea is that when one is born with a certain genital organ system that you can observe from the outside, right?
Yeah.
And if you were to observe the genital system, the genital organs of a newborn baby, there's a high chance that you will ascribe that baby one of the three sexes that we know. So there's male, there's female, and then there's intersex. And oftentimes, an intersex is a very vast term in terms of the different kinds of intersex variations that one can have in terms of their external morphological conformation. And this is all happening at the level of external morphology. So we are not even talking about anatomy or physiology. Anatomy would mean that you really look at the organs that are inside. So all of us have internal genital organs as well. And we are not even talking at the level of physiology, which would mean that there are hormones that are contingent upon your sex or contribute to the development of sex. So we are not talking about either anatomy or physiology. Most often than not, we are born, doctors take a look at genitals that they see externally, and you're assigned a sex at birth. So as a baby, doctors will say, this is M, or this is F, or this is I, which is intersex. And sex is itself fairly complex. We understand that simply because even if we study developmental biology from a very basic level, so we know that until about a certain period of time, the fetus has virtually no sex, right? So the fetus is a sexless gonad. It has a chromosomal conformation, which would be either XX, XY, or a combination of XXY, X0, etc. And these combinations are what is called the chromosomal sex of the fetus. The fetus has no other forms of sex assigned till then. So after a point of time, the fetus develops, and sometime during fetal development, what happens is the Y chromosome, if it's present in the cells of the fetus, it undergoes what is called transcription and translation to eventually, and there's a region in the Y chromosome, which is called the sex determining region of Y. Okay, so the Y chromosome is a chromosome which looks like a rod. And it's basically composed of DNA that is wrapped around proteins. And this DNA will have genes, which are basically sections of DNA that code for a protein. So in that Y chromosome, there's a region in that chromosome, which codes for a protein called sex determining region of Y. It's called SRY.
I see. Okay.
So
I understand.
Sorry, I'm just having coffee as we speak. This is a coffee table conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I had some coffee, actually. I was going to make one, but I got late.
So SRY, so once SRY is produced, what it does is it actually acts on the gonadal tissue, which is developing in the fetus. That is, so before the SRY starts getting transcribed, getting expressed, what we have is a bipotential gonad. It can either become something like the uterus, the fallopian tubes, and the ovary, or it can become the testes, the vas deferens, the sperm tube, the other secondary sex organs of the male body, which would include the seminiferous tubules, the prostate, etc., and the penis. So once the Y chromosome starts expressing, what it does is that it suppresses the bipotentiality of the gonad, and it actually transforms it. It pushes it towards a male internal sex. So what you start forming are these early testes, tubes that will eventually become the sperm tubes through which sperm is going to get ejaculated. And you will have the secondary sex organs starting to form, like prostate being one example. In the absence of a Y chromosome, the gonad is expected, the bipotential gonad is expected to develop into the female gonadal system, which would basically be the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, the uterus. And this is just, so basically we've already identified several aspects of sex. So you have chromosomal sex, you have the internal genital sex or the internal gonadal sex, which is at the level of the fetus. And then in the case of males, for instance, right before the fetus is born, the testes descend into the scrotum sac and the penis is formed just sometime before that. So that is the external sex. So there are already these layers of sex in some sense, as Anne Foster Sterling, who's a biologist who's written about this extensively, calls it. So there's this layers of sex, and this particular model of sex has been very well explained by scholars like John Money, reproductive biologists who've worked on this for a very long time. So sex is itself very complex. I wanted to make the point that sex itself is fairly complex. It's not something like male, female, and there's some issue and you have intersex, but there are these several layers, these several processes, and they don't necessarily always agree with each other.
And something for the feminists to notice, that it is the default state, most of the time, is XX. So in the absence of a Y chromosome, you just turn out to be a woman. So ladies, you are by default how humans are.
Right. So the point is that XX might not be the default chromosomal state, but even X naught, for instance, so there's no Y chromosome and there's a missing X chromosome, would also lead to the formation of a female gonadal system. So we don't need to think about chromosomes in terms of presence of XX, but definitely the absence of Y chromosome, which becomes critical to the development of the female gonadal system.
Indeed.
So the idea is that once you're born, you have a certain external sex that somebody is going to take a look at and classify you as either male, female, or intersex. And that's sex, right? And once, but as you start growing, you also exist in a society, right? So in a society, as you grow, you are often told that there are gendered roles. So for instance, one of the things that Anna Foster Sterling has noticed is that, and even several neuroscientists have noticed, is that mothers tend to talk more to their girl children, and they tend to push their male children to really be more physically active. So from a very young age, they'll try to make the boys walk and the girls talk. And this is, by the way, something that's actually coming from a social construction, which is that women are expected to, we have this understanding that women have good language skills. So you sort of start pushing your children to do that because you've been born up in that system. So as you develop within these social systems, within these ideas of what you're supposed to wear if you have a certain sex, what you're supposed to eat, how you're supposed to eat, how you're supposed to talk, what are the subjects that you're supposed to be good at. So science and mathematics are notorious for being so male dominated, and there's been a lot of conversation around how men are particularly pushed since a very young age to do science.
Indeed.
And so anyway, you're growing up within a society which has a certain pre-existing notion of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman. And as you grow up within these systems, you imbibe some of this. And towards the time when you're hitting puberty, you have what is called a gender identity consolidating. So either that gender identity would correspond very cleanly to the kind of sex that you've been assigned at birth. So if you've been assigned male at birth and the gender identity that you take is that of a man. So if you're okay performing as a man, if you're okay living, breathing, walking, talking, eating, studying like a man, then you're a cisgender individual. There is no mismatch between the sex that you've been assigned at birth and the gender identity that you seem to have developed over the time that you've grown. If that's not true, so if there is a mismatch between the two, then what you would effectively be called is this broad umbrella of the term transgender, where there is a mismatch between one's gender identity and the sex that they've been assigned at birth. And oftentimes, not always, people who have this mismatch go through an intense discomfort. This intense discomfort is often with their body. This mismatch can often be in the families. This discomfort can be a result of the families that they live in, the expectations of society. And all of this contributes to this feeling of discomfort, which is called dysphoria, gender dysphoria. So often people try to alleviate that gender dysphoria by affirming their gender. To affirm their gender, people can choose to socially affirm their gender. They can choose to bodily affirm their gender, and they can also choose to medically affirm their gender, which would include taking hormones or blockers. So there are two kinds of medications, and undergoing surgeries if they so wish.
I see. So, but the thing is, a lot of people have a tendency of saying that gender dysphoria is a mental illness. When I mean, this is something that transgender people suffer with when there is that conflict between their identity and with their physical body. But what would you say to people who say that this is just a mental disorder? You should just see a therapist and get fixed.
I'm quite so the thing is that almost every psychiatric and psychologist body in the world has declared uncontroversially that gender dysphoria is not a mental illness. We have the American Psychologists Association, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, all of which has depathologized gender dysphoria, which means that being transgender is not a mental illness, neither is being lesbian, gay, bisexual. So being queer and trans are not mental illnesses. The idea is that if I am going through certain kind of discomfort, so if I have cancer in my body, for instance, and I have depression because I do not like my body anymore, I have had to undergo, let's say, the removal of a limb, and I do not like my body anymore, that would be a kind of body dysphoria that you or I could have without necessarily having gender dysphoria. And we would still go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist in order to seek intervention for that discomfort. So we would say, hey, I don't necessarily hate my body, or I don't necessarily think that I am mentally ill because I got a limb chopped off because it turned cancerous or it turned gangrenous. But I am depressed because I'm in this body that I'm not comfortable with. Can you address that discomfort? Not my identity per se. So one has to think of it in those ways. It's not really being transgender, which is a mental illness. All psychiatric bodies, all diagnostic manuals tell us that uncontroversially. But the reason why one can still go to a therapist if they so wish, and that is why we need therapists who understand this really well, is that I might be seeking ways to understand and address this discomfort that I'm facing. It's not really a question of my identity. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't have any, so a therapist should not be trying to cure me of the fact that I'm transgender or homosexual, but therapists should really be affirming my gender and telling me what are the ways in which I can not feel discomforted with the body that I have or the body that I wish to have. What are the ways in which one can address that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
The analogy is what I was trying to use to sort of get there.
Absolutely. That totally makes sense.
Yeah, people do have dysphorias of various kind. It's not just gender dysphoria. I mean, I might think I might not like my body for a different reason, not necessarily because of the sex organs that it has. I might not like the fact that I have a belly that stands out. I might not like the fact that I have legs which are of unequal sizes. I might not like the fact that my hair starts falling. That doesn't make you mentally sick, but you would still sometimes perhaps go to a therapist to seek remedy.
That does make me a little self-conscious, though. But
oh, that makes me as self-conscious.
you
I
had
definitely
mentioned.
didn't mean you. I
No,
was trying to
I'm
talk
kidding.
about
I'm just
me
messing with you, man.
as I spoke about this. Yeah, it's me who
I'm
is
just messing
losing
with you.
hair. It's me who has a paunch that stands out.
It just goes with, unfortunately, having testosterone in your body. That's it comes with the territory. It's
Yeah.
But I wanted, you had mentioned that there is, of course, we have the difference between having a physical gender presentation, or what do you call it, sex? I keep getting
No,
completely
they
confused
might
between
be,
these two words, though.
they might be conceptually slightly different, right? So sex would be something that the doctor assigns to you. So it would be a culmination of things like you have a penis, you have a scrotal sac, you have testes, vas deferens, you have a certain
Mhm.
level of testosterone in your body, you have XY conformation, etc. All of that would contribute to your sex. Gender
Mhm.
presentation might actually be how you wish to present your gender. So you might wear a t-shirt and a trouser and have a beard and present yourself as one would present a typical man in a society would present themselves.
Mhm.
Or you might choose to wear a sari, clean shave your beard, and you might try to present yourself as somebody who's typically seen as a woman, or you might
Mhm.
choose to keep your beard and the sari and typically choose to present in a way that unsettles this entire question of what is the typical woman and what is the typical man. All of these would be gender presentations
Mhm.
in their own right.
But and these days on social media as well as TV shows, etc., there have been models and other personalities who do wear feminine clothing, but at the same time have a beard, and I think that causes a lot of people a lot of discomfort seeing that. Even though I think it's more being confused and not really being able to understand what is going on. Uh, Plus, you had mentioned that gender fluidity or being non-binary um, can change from day to day. Does that happen frequently? I mean, first of
So
all,
I didn't say, yeah, so I didn't say that they can change from day to day. All I'm saying, I don't think day to day is something that,
okay, I didn't say, okay,
uh,
I misrepresented that.
but
But
what I was saying is, but I think I get your question. So one is the question of confusion. And I mean, I can try to think about this confusion a little later, but gender fluidity, non-binary. So yeah, so what I'm saying is that it's not that today morning I wake up as a man and tomorrow I wake up as a woman. I don't think
Mhm.
that's what we're talking about when we say that gender identities are subject to change. What I
Mhm.
was talking about is that the labels that one finds describing themselves the best can
I
change
see.
over their lifetime. So one might
Okay.
start by saying that, hey, I identify as transgender. And then 10 years later, you find this label called non-binary, which seems to work better than transgender in terms of you feeling that this is defining you the best. So you then choose non-binary as a label to live with. So the gender identity remains somewhere there, something same.
Mhm.
But the kind of vocabulary that you use to describe it, what you think is explaining it the best might change over a period of time. Day to day, I know thousands and thousands of transgender people, and I've never known somebody who's claims that their gender changes on a day-to-day basis. Yeah,
Oh,
that's
thank
probably a
goodness.
myth.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's thanks
Yeah.
for clearing that up, because this is something that, with the confusion that is online media, there
Oh
are
yeah,
people who
absolutely.
say that this sort of thing can happen, which I
Mm.
found kind of surprising. And maybe I misrepresented what you'd said
No,
earlier
no
and
worries about it.
confused it with that. But so the understanding that, I mean, it's kind of hard to understand the transgender community, especially, I mean, not just in this country. I think it's a worldwide phenomenon. But nowadays, there are lots of uh, people, especially what's called the woke community, woke mob, woke crowd, especially in the US, that is having a very unusual effect, especially on social media when it comes to this sort of thing, where they're saying that children are being allowed to have medical interventions, which I don't think is a real thing. But how young does this sort of thing tend to present itself? How young can a child be when they feel that they are probably... Just a second. I just let me just flesh this out. So, how young can a person be before they think that they have, or they identify with a different gender from what they have been assigned at birth? And how often can this be just a child's mind exploring the possibility of itself?
Okay, so the first question, to my knowledge, and this is the last time I read it, I know that children as young as 3 have often expressed being gender non-conforming or expressed feeling like somebody of a different gender. The idea, so the question that you're asking of how much of this can be that of a child's play, sure. I mean, so I'm not denying the possibility that many of these children might have some idea of play when they're talking about having different gender identity. But the kind of interventions that you're talking about, medical interventions, I mean, doctors give that even to adults after a battery of tests and meetings that have been conducted. So rest assured that if a doctor has decided to let their patient, however young that person be, go through any kind of gender affirmation procedure, so be it puberty blockers, be it testosterone blockers, be it estrogen supplements, rest assured that the doctor has had to go through several sittings with this patient. The patient has had to go through, or the client has had to go through several set of tests, psychiatric, endocrinological, and general medical, before this has happened. So one is that. The second is, in these conversations, one finds it really surprising that the worry is around medical supplementation for children, when for several other conditions, children go through pretty severe medical interventions every day, which includes taking hormones, by the way, including people who have delayed puberty, people whose bodies just don't produce the enough amount of hormones. They go through medical interventions, and that's okay. I think part of this is really having a faith in modern medicine when we talk about whether it is okay for very young children to go through the medical gender affirmation procedures. And my sense is that I would trust the doctor who's taking these decisions. Because it's not, I mean, even for adult, I mean, if you were to walk into a clinic tomorrow and say, I want to start testosterone blockers and want to start on estrogen, you would not be able to do that for quite a significant time. The doctor would first evaluate all other parameters of your body, then you would be sent to an endocrinologist and a psychiatrist, and only after that would the 3 meet and decide how to go about this. So a lot of this is about having faith in modern medicine and the doctors who practice it. It's not as much a question of having a faith on the child.
I honestly, I feel that there are not enough people in this country or in this world who have enough faith in medical science or in their family doctor. Some with good reason and most without. That's a totally different topic, though. And it's something that I've tackled on my channel a few times. Now, socially, especially in India, what's it been like to be a non-binary person, somebody who has told people that these are the pronouns I prefer? How have people responded to that in your life?
Yeah. So I think for a substantial period of my life, most people would not understand what this is. And I doubt many people understand gender and the fact that gender can be non-binary at all.
Yeah.
That said, I think thanks to the excellent work that queer and trans people have done in the past 2 decades or so, I do think that the situation is changing, perhaps in elite urban circles, which is probably where I find myself located most of the times. I often find myself in circles of people who are either highly educated or decently making a living, and often in cities. So elite urban circles, there at least I see the situation changing in the sense that people seem to be making an effort to respect pronouns. They might not necessarily respect me as a person. They might also not necessarily understand pronoun use or not be comfortable with it, but they're making an effort, which I think is a good start. I think we can live with that.
And if you're okay discussing it, have you had some unpleasant experiences as well in these circumstances?
Yeah, I think every queer and trans person in this country has had unpleasant experience growing up queer and trans. I'm trying to think of one that I could mention, but yeah, perhaps I'll not, if that's
All right. That's fine. That's fine. Whatever you're comfortable sharing or not, that's totally up to you. So you mentioned queer as well, which is another term that a lot of people don't understand. My understanding of it is that a person who is either lesbian or gay, or maybe another definition that might not be included within those two classifications or labels or anything of that sort, is what does queer go beyond that, or is it just a all-encompassing term as well?
So the term, sorry, please go
No,
ahead.
for sexual orientation, or does it go far beyond that?
Oh, I would think it goes far beyond that. So queer as a term was primarily used as a slang
Yeah.
for gay men, particularly, probably for a long time. Need to brush up my history on that. Was it for queer women as well? I don't remember, but
I don't think anybody seems to have a problem with lesbians.
But the point is,
Oddly enough.
anyway, it was often used as a slang, and eventually, when in the US the gay and lesbian rights movement started, one of the terms that was reclaimed in terms of the fact that something that was initially used as a slang, but then the community chose to use it for themselves and sort of articulate their identity through it in almost an act of resistance. So queer was one of the terms that was reclaimed, and it means weird. And the idea was that, yeah, we are weird, so what, right? But I think operationally right now, as we understand the use of the term, I think we, for the most part, what we see this term representing is people who do not conform to the stereotypical and normative ways of being sexual or being gendered. So you can either, so what that would mean is that anything that is beyond the normal ways in which people identify their sex and gender, identify who they have sex with and how they have sex with, would all constitute queer as a term. So it's very expansive term. And there's a lot of work in gender and sexuality studies, which has also conceptually defined the term queer in the, I mean, at least in the sense that it has theoretical implications for the kind of knowledge that is produced in gender and sexuality studies. And there's an entire branch of theory called queer theory that's emerged in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and continues to be a very blooming field in terms of the work that's happened there. So it's spoken a lot about how gender is socially constructed. It's spoken a lot about sexuality. It's spoken a lot about the relationship between sexuality and nation state, political economy, a lot of very interesting work coming from there. And even queer theory has had a very interesting conversations with science, particularly the discipline of biology, where a lot of early work in this intersection has been about finding instances of, let's say, homosexuality in quote unquote the natural world. So you go and sort of try to find out monkeys, okay, they seem to be having homosexual sex. Okay, bonobos seem to be having homosexual sex. Penguins seem to be having homosexual sex. Scarab beetles seem to be having homosexual sex. You name an animal and there's a high chance that they also have homosexual sex. And now we've moved to a point where we've had some excellent work on the genetics of sexuality, and we've had some very interesting findings that have come from there. People have tried to investigate sexuality.
Like what? What are some of the biggest findings that have come?
So the biggest finding that we have in the recent years is that there's no gay gene, and that contradicts our assumptions in the 1990s when people posited that there are certain locations in our genome, certain genes that can be traced to homosexuality, or homosexuality could be traced to those genes. In 2019, there was a Nature paper which looked at 500,000 genomes. It did something that is called a genome-wide association study. It's basically you track the entire genome, positions in the entire genome, and you try to see in a family. So you basically point out in one family who are the people who report being homosexual, and then you take a look at their entire genomes, and then you see whether there's any parts of the genomes that have moved across generations, and whether these two correlate, so sexuality and the kind of inheritance that they show. And the most amazing finding is that there is no gay gene, which is one of the most brilliant findings that we have from a really cutting edge, large scale, extremely rigorously done scientific study. What we do understand is that sexuality as a whole, so both heterosexuality and homosexuality, are partly heritable. And this partly is a loose term. So if you ask me, is 50% of your sexuality heritable? I don't know. I don't think anybody does. It's a very loose term, but but at least it's partly heritable. But any knowledge of genetics cannot determine the sexuality of a person. So even if I tell you what my genetic composition is, you will not be able to correlate it to a certain kind of sexuality. So some of this is interesting work from the genetics of sexuality. We've also had some very interesting work that's even raised the question of why do we need to investigate sexuality through a scientific lens, and people are divided on this question. And people are quite significantly divided on this question. One of the main reasons why one would want science to not necessarily be concerned with this investigation is because in the past, whenever science has been used to investigate the origins of any community that is marginalized, it has been extremely violent. So if you take the example of Black people and the kind of eugenics work that happened the world over, but particularly in Europe and even in the US.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then we know that's not been great. When you look at women, as somebody who was trained in neuroscience, one of the earliest things that one realized needed debunking was the idea of the male brain and the female brain, and the kind of really wrong things that these myths have been used to substantiate, which have been deeply patriarchal and misogynist.
Absolutely.
So the skepticism of a scientific investigation into sexuality is well-founded. So I wouldn't say that this is anti-science, or in the same way that something like believing in the flat earth is. The skepticism is deeply grounded in the idea that whenever science has in the past tried to investigate marginalized communities, it's not done that with great intentions.
Unfortunate, but at the same time, at this point of time, we do know that science is very important in understanding anything, in understanding the natural way of things.
Absolutely. So one of the things is that, so you're absolutely correct, is that science is indeed an important way. The point is that there are other ways in which you can also investigate something like gender and sexuality, especially when people have used methods from the social sciences, particularly qualitative research, ethnographies, which have been really foundational in even influencing what we understand as the science of sexuality at this point. So in fact, if you look at any of the recent, even the 2019 Nature paper that I'm talking about, it was done in conversation with social scientists, and perhaps the strength of the study emerges from the presence of a social scientist in the group. So what we are looking at basically is a highly interdisciplinary landscape. I think there's good reason to be skeptical of a value-neutral scientific investigation, quote-unquote purely scientific investigation into origins of sexuality, its evolvability, its genetics, etc. And I think if that kind of research has to be done, there needs to be the presence of somebody who understands the ethics and the history of
Oh, absolutely.
sexuality, and somebody who's trained as a social scientist and can really supplement these methods with more qualitative methods, including interviews and ethnographies, that can really help us put some of the scientific findings in context.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we are basically looking at a highly interdisciplinary landscape where we do not want the sciences and the social sciences and their understanding of sexuality to be in conflict with each other. And to my understanding, they're actually not, at least the kind of landscape that I'm seeing in front of me, they're not. The idea is that there's a deep-seated skepticism of one discipline for the other. And I'm hoping that the skepticism can be set aside and people can probably work together as we understand experiences.
Or even if there is, then it should be, at least it should be helpful. It shouldn't get in the way of things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, you had mentioned earlier that there is no gay gene. This has been very well established. So is there a better understanding of what leads to homosexuality in the first place? I mean, it is heritable to a certain extent, but what causes it? And then
so if we were to imagine sexuality as the trait that we are talking about, and you have heterosexuality and homosexuality as two sides of a coin, and they're not necessarily two sides of a coin, right? There are sexual orientations, and there are people who would not necessarily be only homosexual and only heterosexual. But for sake of simplicity, for a simplistic argument, let's try to do this. Let's try to imagine the trait as sexuality, and then we're talking about its different forms, heterosexuality and homosexuality. Anybody who studied Mendelian genetics is familiar with this kind of argumentation. You have seed color, and then you have green and yellow, two kinds of seed color, right? And then you would try to do these crosses. What we do understand is that sexuality as a trait is perhaps governed by a cluster of genes. And this is not a small cluster that we are talking about. It's a fairly complex cluster of genes. And
after all, this is one of the purposes of DNA is procreation. And I would imagine that it's an extremely large part of...
Yeah, so sexuality itself, sexuality as the trait. So just like seed color would be influenced by several genes, sexuality as a trait is perhaps partly influenced by a cluster of genes. And we also understand that there are epigenetic influences. So the kind of modifications that happen, not at the level of the DNA, but at the level of the RNA that is produced or the level of the protein that is produced. Epigenetic modifications also perhaps have some role to play. And we also understand, I mean, all recent studies of homosexuality, both in animals and human beings, tell us that there's a very large role of social influences in constructing any idea of sexuality. And this is not just about homosexuality, it's as much about heterosexuality. So this is what we know.
And there's I think there was one article I read which said that the more boys or sequentially girls who a mother gives birth to, the higher probability the next one will be homosexual. Does that have any...
I would think that's absolute crap, but I mean, I've not come across that, but nothing that our current scientific model of sexuality and gender tells us leads me to think that this would be true.
All right, fair enough. Now, of course, bisexuality, I think by this point of time, most people would have understood that it's both heterosexuality and homosexuality in the same person. The person basically can be attracted to either sex, or maybe even a non-binary person for that matter. Would bisexual include that?
Absolutely. So bisexual, pansexual, yeah, these terms.
Pansexual, yes, there we go. And I think there's one part which very few people understand, which is asexual.
Right.
So that's basically a person who is not interested in having sex with anyone. Is that accurate?
Right. Yeah. I think one needs to qualify that definition a little more in terms of
Hmm.
saying that might be a person who doesn't have, for the most part, strong sexual attractions towards people of any sex. But I do think that asexuality is one of the identities that we have very little narratives from. And when you do not have enough narratives, the identity gets to be invisibilized, and we
Hmm.
might all be not understanding this very clearly. So I don't also want to talk about it without having a very clear understanding of it myself. But that would be my sense. I think a lot of more qualification to that definition is needed. So
I
it's
see.
so yeah, it's not that they do not want to have sex at all. It might just so be that they go have sex. But we all understand that our sexuality is not just an act of having sex. It's something that you embody for an extended period of time in your life. So if you're attracted to
Mhm.
women, it's not the one act of sex that makes you heterosexual, but the idea that of being sexually attracted to women as part of your life that sort of extends over a period of your life. And I think
Mm.
that extended period is very critical when we think about something like asexuality, that for the most part, they perhaps do not are not sexually attracted towards people of any sex.
Indeed. And I
Yeah.
wanted to, one thing which I wanted the listeners to also kind of
Hmm.
understand, at least from my understanding, that
Hmm.
when we have this collection of communities in the LGBTQIA plus,
Hmm.
these classifications of labels, these communities, they're when we're talking about gender identity, we're talking about gender, like
Hmm.
sexual orientation.
Hmm.
There is no straight line. There is no actual, I mean, clear distinction. Everything blurs into the next. We're talking about an entire spectrum, as the rainbow flag kind of tries to portray. There are everything has blurred lines, so one line can blur into the next. I mean, am I being correct here? Because I don't
Yeah,
think
I
that
think
there's
yeah,
any
I think the
exact
idea
distinction.
yeah, I think the idea is that we like to think of the world as or people as living in boxes. So there are these very
Yeah.
neat boundaries that you're able to draw in terms of one's identities. And the idea is that it's not really that strict. These are not like boxes that we are living in. These are these nice
Yeah.
blurry zones, and one should be able to inhabit those also. Yeah.
Absolutely. And one thing, so intersex, which is the
Mm.
last letter, and of course, plus means everything else that can be included
Mhm.
in the
Mhm.
atypical or non binary sexual identity and orientation
Mhm.
world. So intersex is what I feel a lot of people kind of feel
Mhm.
is what constitutes the community of hijras, or a person who has
Right.
both sexual physical representations in on their bodies. So is that accurate? Is that correct? You have worked with the
Yeah,
community quite
I
a bit.
wouldn't
Is
think
that
so.
right?
So I think the term hijra would mean something very specific in the sense that it is a cultural identity. It's
I see.
actually not something that we would think of as a gender identity in the sense that it doesn't define just gender. It really talks
Hmm.
about a certain way of living. It includes the kind of clothes that one wears, the kind of religion one follows, the kind of family structure, the kind of kinship structure that one follows.
Hmm.
Um, Gender being a part of it. So simply put, no Hijra people, not all Hijra people are intersex. Also, not all transgender people are Hijras. There's a certain protocol that you have to follow to sort of become to sort of called somebody who's a Hijra,
Hmm.
and yeah, it's a cultural community. It's not a community that's just defined by a gender or sex identity.
So could you help us humanize the community a little bit more? Because a lot of people, I misrepresent them, look at them in, I mean, of course, speak about them in derogatory ways. I've met plenty of them. Some of them have been very nice. Some of them have been there just for collecting money, as they are supposed to do. But I, I've watched documentaries, I've read articles about them, but from have you said have you worked with that
Yeah,
community at
I
all?
have. Yeah, I've worked with Hijra people for a significant period of time,
Hmm.
especially a lot of my formative work in gender and sexuality has really come from about 7 months that I spent very closely in a Hijra community in Hyderabad, which is particularly for the kind of public interest litigations that I was filing along with two other people. So one thing is that I do not want to speak about the community and its practices in great detail. It's something that is usually discouraged when you're
Okay.
not a Hijra yourself.
Mhm.
Part of it is because that it's a far more complex than the kind of conversations that we can perhaps have here. And B,
Mhm.
there's no good reason for us to make these practices that have been going on for at least 5,000 years. We have very good historical evidence in very private community spaces to sort of make it open to discussion for people who definitely are not Hijras. That said, I do want to address the question of begging and sex work, which are the two traditional occupations that people from Hijra communes are often employed in. I think the point is that there really is no option more often than not for people who come from Hijra communities to really find any other kind of employment that we are looking at. For the longest part, they were not even considered valid citizenship by the country. So only in 2014, when the Nalsa versus Union of India judgment came, were transgender persons, including Hijra people, given the right to self-identify their gender and equal citizenship in par with every other individual in the country, which meant that years of oppression, so about 200 years of colonial oppression and some more after that, what that has meant is that they've been really pushed into the margins to the point where accessing education, accessing employment has been both extremely tenuous. And the traditional occupations of begging and sex work have been the only ways in which they've been able to fend for themselves and for the communities that they inhabit. So what that means is that we need more structural interventions at the level of making education more accessible, transgender friendly, making employment more transgender friendly and accessible for people to be able to find other modes of employment if they so wish.
I see. All right. I think that would be very important in getting them just into having more dignified lives. I think that's the most important thing because they do not get much dignity as it is. At least in my life, I try to interact with them in as respectful a manner as I possibly can. I think anybody listening, I think that's the first and best thing that you can do. And until we can see bigger social change and move that forward. Now, okay, but you're good for time on the whole?
Yes, perhaps we can close in another 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. In fact, I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on what you think, at least, especially in the Indian context, how the transgender community is most misunderstood, at least as far as you've encountered, unless you've already addressed that. And what is it that us in terms of people who are not within the LGBTQIA plus communities, what can we do better to help especially these communities be better accepted and be better understood in Indian society?
Well, that's a hard one. Yeah. So I already mentioned that one of the ways in which transgender people are substantially marginalized in the country are by really the kind of lack of access to opportunities that they have for education, employment, and other civil and substantive rights, as we say. Really, what can you and perhaps listeners do includes thinking about how to increase this access, right? So how do you ensure that you're able to really get trans people into education and employment? So if you're somebody who can employ, who can hire, please hire trans people. If you're somebody who can educate, who runs a school perhaps, or has some influence in running a school, please do that. And if you are none of those, then you can perhaps begin by putting the money where your mouth is, which means that do not try to save your 10 rupees from the Hijra person who's begging on a train. For you, probably that 10 rupees is what you'll spend in a cigarette in the next ride, but this person is really trying to live on a day-to-day basis with the money that they make. So I think some of these are starting points. It's really hard to sort of pinpoint ways, but yes, and educate others around you so that the general myths that we have spoken about today and the kind of misconceptions that people have also start to shatter and break down.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
at least on my part, I do try and contest these things, ideas about non-binary people who don't conform to the typical heterosexual behaviors or sexual orientations. I do try to just say that, guys, just speak about them respectfully. Don't make fun of them just from that perspective or anything of that sort.
Yeah.
And I think all of us can do that a little bit by just educating the people around us, our immediate families, because I think a lot of people from the previous generation and maybe before that as well are not willfully ignorant. They've just been brought up in a particular way where they haven't been exposed to the open discussion of sexuality and gender identity out in the open. So just open up, talk to everyone in context, of course. And I think a very important thing is if you know of someone who is talking about their identity, feeling that they have some gender dysphoria coming in, or they have a certain feeling that they're not the gender that they have been born into, that you help them find the resources they need, help them find maybe a therapist, maybe who is knowledgeable about gender and gender dysphoria cases, etc., and kind of just help them out the best you can. Thank you, Sayantan, for helping us understand the entire the communities. I think this country has a long way to go before we really open up and become completely accepting of everyone. I think this is a transitory phase, which I think we're all going through, and I think social media is doing harm as well as good in both helping people understand and misunderstand the thing. So having these kinds of open conversations is very helpful in clearing us up. So thank you very much for your time. I hope to have you back. Yeah. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions for Sayantan, they are on Twitter. You're on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle?
Queer Springs, QUEER SPRINGS.
All right. And any other places where they can find your work or they can contact you?
Yeah, so my Twitter handle has my portfolio that one should be able to access, which I update it fairly regularly with all the work that I've done. Great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. And thanks a lot.
Thanks for coming on. And thank you, everybody, for watching. This has been Rationable Conversations with Sayantan Dutta. And we've been understanding the LGBTQIA plus communities a lot better and a lot deeper. And I hope this has helped you clear up any of your doubts and thoughts that you have. If you have any questions, as I said, please contact Sayantan or put your comments down in the comments. Obviously, give this video a like if you enjoyed that, and please do subscribe for more interviews like this. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, be rational.